Welcome everyone to our edweb.net webinar today. We have Dr. Bernadette Musetti with us today to talk about how technology promotes EL and family success. Don't forget, if you haven't already joined the EdWeb community, we have a community set up strictly for technology and language instruction. We would love for you to join us. All the resources are free. There's online discussions, the webinar recordings. If you aren't attending live, but you're watching the recording, that's also where you'll find the quiz in order to receive your CE certificate. And you'll also be able to see all the activity that you have in EdWeb on your homepage. So join us there at edweb.net language. And to get your certificate, there was a question earlier as well. You will be emailed your certificate after 24 hours if you attended live and you pre-registered for this event. If you are watching this as a recording or you weren't able to connect via computer and you're only joining by phone, there is a quiz available at that edweb.net/languages, and you will be able to take that quiz and receive your CE certificate. So be sure to go ahead and follow up on that and take advantage of that as well. Now, Dr. Bernadette Musetti is here with us today. Super excited that she's here. She's currently an associate professor and director of liberal studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. She teaches a wide range of courses, including education and the public good, paradigms of education, and methods for English language development. Her research and publications are tons. She's got research about English learners as well as English learners and the Common Core standards. And we are very lucky that she made time out of her very busy day to join us today to talk about English learners and their needs in the classroom. And I am, today's agenda, real quick, we're just going to talk about English learners, teachers making a difference, how to accelerate their learning, how to use technology and blended learning. And we're going to wrap up with family engagement ideas and then open up for a short Q&A period at the very end of this session. So that's kind of what you're looking at today in this hour. Real quick, I'm about to go off screen, but my name is Melanie Rogers. I am the training team lead at Rosetta Stone. Been teaching technology for over 20 years at this point and working with teachers across the United States to help them implement Rosetta Stone into their classrooms. We talked a little bit about Bernadette and who she is, so we know a little bit more about her. And we're going to do a poll question. EdWeb, if you can throw that poll up, because we'd like to learn a little bit more about you. Who are you? We'd like to know where you fit into your school district. And so we'll quickly gather up some answers for those questions. Lots of teachers with us today. We love the teachers, as well as quite a few paraprofessionals. We've got almost just as many paraprofessionals with us as teachers. That's wonderful. Glad to see that. Super happy to see that. And EdWeb, if you want to just close out that poll, thank you guys again for attending. Really appreciate it. And Dr. Musetti, I'm going to pass it over to you, and you are ready to go.
Okay, thanks so much, Melanie.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone for being here. I'm thrilled to be here with you, and just hello to, I see that you're from all over the country. We were talking about the weather earlier. I grew up in the Midwest, and so I'm not missing the winter. It's about 80 degrees in LA today. A little more about me. I am a social studies and an English teacher, as well as an ESL teacher at the K-12 level, and I taught in Mexico and the US. And my very first job out of the PhD program was at the California Department of Ed, and I have to say that was quite an education, working at the Department of Ed, because of course, the departments of education are what drive most of what we do, or a lot of what we do. But I also worked at a big center where we worked with about 6 to 10 teams of 6 to 10 educators in each team, each school district team, administrators, teachers, and others. And the goal was to write action plans. We did a lot of professional development, brought in experts from all over the country, and did a lot of professional development around raising achievement for English learners. And so I'll refer to some of those action plans and some of those innovative things that some of those teams did over the years, where I think that might be helpful to you. But I just wanted to start with a disclaimer about the terminology. So in this presentation, we'll use the term English learners, but that privileges the English and doesn't really acknowledge that students already speak another language or maybe several other languages. So emergent bilinguals in many ways might be a preferable term, or even English knowing bilinguals, where, for example, students grow up bilingual, but a given test might not show them as proficient in, say, academic English. These students are also learning English as an additional language, where they might speak, 3, 4, or 5 languages already, primary language other than English, or a primary home language other than English. So all of these terms carry particular connotations, and I wanted to acknowledge that I understand that, and I actually think the connotations are important. So in terms of the EL landscape, English learners are a very fast growing group. They constitute about 5 million students in the US. California alone has 1.4 million, a huge number of English learners. English learners are about 10% of the school age population. Their predicted enrollment by 2025 will be 25% of the school population, and increasing to 40% in the 2030s. So that's really just around the corner. So I used to have, and of course that's none of you because you wouldn't be on this webinar if you weren't interested, but I've had teachers say that I don't have those students, so I don't need to learn those skills. But I assured them, you might not have them today, but you definitely will have English learners. So 80% of all English learners speak Spanish as their primary language, but English learners as a group speak hundreds of primary languages and dialects. After Spanish, the most common languages are Chinese, Vietnamese, French, Arabic, and then other languages, a host of other languages. So like I said, it's about 10% of the school enrollment English learners are. And one thing that some people are surprised to learn is that the vast majority are US born. So at the elementary level, well over 3/4 of English learners in K-5 are US born. I don't know if that surprises you. And then at the middle and secondary level, more than 2/3 or about 2/3 are US born. So you can see that the vast majority of English learners are US born. Now, certainly there are a lot of immigrant students as well. But most English learners are born in this country, are born in the US. And 65% of high school English learners are, we say ELL, long-term English learners. So that means that they've been English learners for 6 years or more. And it's actually a very large percentage of students that end up long-term English learners. Depending on where you are, it could be anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 of all students end up being long-term English learners. So that's not good. We need to do better. And at the aggregate, we can, of course, these are generalizations, but in general, English learners are concentrated in high poverty, highly linguistically and racially segregated schools. Many teachers with English learners in their classes are not fully prepared to effectively teach these students. English learners are the lowest performing major subgroup of students in K-12 schools, performing well below non-EL students. And they have a 63% graduation rate versus an 82% graduation rate for students overall. And that's compared to, for example, 72% graduation rate for students living in poverty. So again, there's a lot of room for improvement. So what do we know makes a difference? There are a lot of things. These are just a few. But we know that sustained primary language instruction, when and where possible, is really important. And hopefully we'll come back to this at the end again and we'll revisit this. But it might be counterintuitive to some people. So you might think that more English sooner is better, but actually high quality primary language instruction is correlated with high eventual English levels. So why is that? You might wonder, why is that? Well, first of all, a student is learning in the language they know best, their primary language. To learn in your primary language esteems, especially in a culture where languages have there are different status, they hold different status in society. So when you're learning in school in your primary language, that necessarily esteems your language and culture, or at least doesn't diminish your language and culture. And we know that strong skills transfer. So that's why we say you only learn to read once. So for those of you who are at the elementary level, you know, the leveled books, some of the publishers have leveled books that go 1 through 36. We know that at around level 20, your reading skills transfer. So again, we might have time to revisit this, but I wanted to, I just wanted to talk about that. So, you know, learning in your primary language promotes positive identity development, which, you know, leads to more school engagement, or at least it's not the opposite. At least it's not a push out factor where students are rejecting schooling that rejects them, as Angela Valenzuela said. Okay, so what else do we know makes a difference? Teachers who are prepared attitudinally and pedagogically to reach and teach English learners. And I'm so happy to say, this should say educators, not just teachers, because I'm thrilled to see so many para-educators on this call. That's fantastic. So what does that mean, prepared attitudinally and pedagogically to reach and teach English learners? It means you're prepared attitudinally, which is the next check mark, the next bullet point, that you have high expectations and an asset-based approach. You expect students to succeed, and then you're going to teach to that. And then you know how to do that. You know how to teach English learners so that they can succeed at high levels. And to do that, you have to be able to teach language and content simultaneously, which for most people takes some specialized learning. It takes some professional development. So we need to accelerate learning for English learners. Why? Because native English speakers are not waiting for them to catch up. I think it was Jim Cummins who said, you know, they're trying to catch a moving target, the native English speaking student who's going on to the next grade level, the next set of rigorous standards. So if English learners are going to catch up and keep up, the instruction for them really needs to be accelerated, which means they need the best teachers, the most state-of-the-art materials and tools, the most creative, supportive environments. And sadly, we know that's often not what they get. So they need targeted language instruction as well as language and content integration. And we know that the best way to learn a language is through meaningful content and a need to communicate. So the more we can make it, the more we can make schooling relevant and linked to students' real lives, the better off students will be. So what else can we do? We need to protect and create more time for content area learning and skills development, because English learners just need more time to learn. They need specially designed instruction, and they need state-of-the-art materials and tools. So the judicious use of technology can help to meet some of these needs that English learners have in terms of learning opportunity and time devoted to learning. You know, we talk about the achievement gap. it's interesting. Again, I think the terminology matters, just like we talked about in the beginning with the terms for English learners. Talking about the achievement gap puts the onus on the student or blames the student for not achieving. Whereas if we talk about an opportunity to learn gap, then the responsibility falls more on society and schools and systems and institutions. So technology can provide more learning opportunities and time for learning. It can provide more differentiated and targeted, specially designed language and content instruction, or rather it can allow us to do that. More tools and materials, and digital readiness. Digital readiness is important because in this era of where the students are taking all of these standardized tests, they're all computer-based, or many of them are computer-based. So for students who are already at a huge disadvantage in terms of the language of the test, then if they don't know how to manipulate the tools, and in some cases it's more than just clicking. You have to be able to move things around. So in digital readiness is important. It's another equity. It's another equity feature. NAEP, the National Assessment of Ed Progress, they also look at this along with math and reading and other things, but they find by 8th grade there's a big gap between English learners and non-English learners in terms of technology and information literacy. So this disparity, this digital divide is really the disparity in access to and familiarity with technology tools. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that you know, some students have a lot more access and familiarity than others. So blended learning can accelerate language development. And as you know, blended learning combines face-to-face classroom learning with technology-mediated learning. So students are learning in a technology-mediated environment as well as a traditional face-to-face classroom. And the other feature, or another feature of blended learning, is it gives the students some control over some elements, such as time in which they would do things, the pace at which they would do things, the content, possibly, and the place where they would do the learning or the studying. And it can promote learner autonomy and independent learning, which of course is important for all learners. So English learners can benefit greatly from tools that allow them to practice and receive feedback on their performance, such as voice recognition to promote listening and speaking skills, and modeled language use. They can actually hear how it sounds, how they're sounding. You know, it's not unusual for English learners to sit all day long in school and say very little. Very few opportunities to speak, or especially for extended discourse. And, you know, going back, move students along in their learning. And this is so important in terms of the acceleration, because of course, what we're trying to avoid is the situation of long-term English learners. So it does take a long time to develop academic English, but the more students can develop their English faster, the better for them. And so especially in cases where that might promote reclassification, that's very important for students. So the main purpose of using a blended learning approach is to maximally differentiate and personalize instruction for English learners, in which they receive timely, meaningful feedback and assessment with individual support. So opportunities to build background knowledge and do language study, that's another possible advantage of blended learning. So building background knowledge or activating background knowledge if they already have it, doing language study of various types, doing genre study, word study, cognate study, opportunities to practice skills, language skills, listening, reading, writing, speaking, and use language in meaningful ways, and timely, often immediate feedback, and more formative assessment for learning. So formative assessment is super important, both for the teacher and the learner. Other possible advantages is it can promote collaboration, depending on how you design it, and more learning time can accelerate, as we talked about, English language development and hopefully promote reclassification to fully English proficient. And then a few blended learning approaches to planning and instruction. So structurally, one thing you could do is if you have a designated English language development block of time, that time can be used to support other important content courses where students can study whatever it is they need to know in terms of the language, the structures, the content. I mean, ideally, all of the teachers would be the ELD specialist. You know, that would be the ideal situation. Or it could be a co-teaching model. But I guess what I would warn against is what I've seen where a co-teaching model done very poorly would be the English language development specialist getting a Post-it in her box saying, this is what we're doing today in class. No, it has to be a close collaboration of professionals. And in that case can be very effective and very helpful for the student. There are lots of, if you look up blended learning, there are lots of different models. And one of them is the stations model. So all that means is that you have stations and at least one station, it could be more, but at least one station has an online learning component. So for example, it might be, a web quest that you're going to do a review and a synthesis or something along that line. I've seen fifth graders do that. And it wasn't just a review, they'd already studied these things, but then they were able to really go more in depth. So it was more like an extension. And I remember one of the things they had studied was Dia de los Muertos. And these were students this was many years ago, and these students had never, a lot of them had never even been on a computer. And I remember one little fifth grader asked me, at the Dia de los Muertos site, you could write to a deceased relative. And so he was writing sadly to his mom, and he said, he asked me, does the message go straight to heaven or does it have to stop anywhere first? It was very sweet and sort of sad, but they had no conception of the technology. But that's what's so cool about kids. Adults blame it on themselves. Oh, I'm tech illiterate. Oh, I can't do this. Oh, I don't. No, kids just blame it on the computer. They just blame it on the technology and just keep on going. It's wonderful. And, stations, as all of you elementary educators know, are really important to free the teacher up to work with reading groups. But I've seen stations done masterfully and very appropriately at middle and secondary. For example, a whole unit on light and sound at secondary. And then independent or orbital studies. So in the differentiated approach, that's one of the strategies is orbitals. And what that means is that the whole class is studying a topic, but then students have subtopics that orbit around that main topic. So in this case, in keeping with the orbital theme, it could be you're studying the solar system and students take different planets, let's say. That's another structure that you could use for blended learning because everyone's doing their own research then in their own study within that topic, within that larger topic. And then, so those are sort of structural ways to go about it. And then in terms of curricular ways, just some things that I've seen teachers do and that I think are fantastic and really important are funds of knowledge type projects and where you're really leveraging expertise in families, extended families, parents, community members, where that expertise is brought into the classroom and is the basis of curricular units. And I'm thinking of a quote by Louise Moll and colleagues who said, Louise Moll, I think, said, the students were as smart as allowed by the curriculum. So in other words, students will reach our expectations. And so we should give them, fabulous, interesting projects to do. Another thing that I've seen teachers, and by the way, I've seen these funds of knowledge projects at the kinder level where they were working on a big unit on communities. And one of the dads who was in construction came in and they built a whole community, and it was just very cool. Another thing I've seen and been a part of is global electronic learning networks. So students in your class could be connected with students in another class. It could be across the world, it could be across the state, it could be across the city. But they're connected in networks working on projects. So for example, in Georgia, in North Atlanta, high school students were working with students on the topic of coffee, and the students in Costa Rica, which was that was their network, those students actually lived on a coffee farm. And so, you know, the two, as a starting point, the students had very different conceptions about what coffee was as a global commodity. You know, to the students in North Georgia, in North Atlanta, coffee was Starbucks. But to these students who actually grew coffee, whose parents grew coffee, they had a totally different perspective. So they did this fantastic global electronic learning network and this big unit around coffee. And then cultural studies or critical studies, identity text. So students that, I think it's important to think about projects that students could do that validate and honor and promote positive identity development. So Jim Cummins writes a lot about this. But cultural studies where students are really investigating their own cultures, other cultures, promoting critical literacy. Students not having access to critical literacy and high levels of multiple literacies, that's one of the things that leads to dropout and feeds into the school to prison pipeline. So keeping students in school, engaging them in real work in their real lives, validating their identities. This reminds me of an 8th grade project that I had 2 master's students, and they both worked at the same school. And in the 8th grade, all of the students, including a lot of English learners, did a big project on impacting my peers and changing tomorrow. So they had to research. This was how they learned to do the long research paper, and it lasted all semester. They had to research someone or some organization that was making a difference in the world. But this was within the context of who am I and what impact do I want to have on the world, which is a very important thing to think about when you're in 8th grade. That's a critical time to think about that. So students did this in-depth research. Each student did a different person or organization and wrote up their big research project and then presented it at the end of the year to a large audience, all the teachers, all the parents. I was invited as a university professor. And, so it combined both of these things, learning to do research with, positive identity development and thinking about who am I and what impact do I want to have on the world. I've even seen newcomers at 5th grade, 4th or 5th grade do PowerPoint. They had just arrived, they spoke almost no English, but they were doing their immigration stories. And so they used PowerPoint, and each slide only had maybe one phrase or one sentence of text, but it had a lot of visuals. So a lot of, clip art and other visuals. And then the students did voiceover. So they actually were reading the text. And they were very poignant. So I guess that's another point I would like to make is that what is basic for English learners is not, what's fundamental is deep engagement and acknowledgement of a student's experience and the language they already speak and what they've gone through in life, regardless of their age or their English level. Because if you're, oftentimes students, especially newcomers, will have experiences that none of us have had and we wouldn't want to have in many cases. So just to respect their experience and realize that that's what's basic about it is that they might have a lot of life experience. So the basics doesn't mean, necessarily decoding or even students recently arrived can do compare and contrast. They can compare where they've been to where they are now. So English learners beyond the classroom, one popular use of blended learning is the approach of reversing the lecture and homework aspects of the course. So this allows the student to arrive to class familiar with the lecture, and class time is devoted to discussion, problem solving, etc. This, of course, is what we know as the flipped classroom, where the students come prepared. They've already done the background reading or listened to the lecture or whatever it is. And one thing that's good about learning beyond the classroom and these different approaches to blended learning is it can allow students to work through the material at their own pace, and it can allow them to involve parents and others in the learning process, but where the teacher's always the critical factor, or one of the critical factors. So Linda Darling-Hammond and colleagues were looking at-risk learners, and they said learners who worked with teachers alongside their online experience were much more likely to say that they developed an interest in the subject and increased their academic standing, which is to say, teachers have to be there every step of the way, even when students are working more independently. But again, blended learning can open up collaborative possibilities with parents, community members, others. And we know that when parents are involved in students' schooling, of course, students do better. So higher test scores, better grades, better attendance, more homework completed, more positive attitudes and behavior, greater enrollment in post-secondary education. But I want to say a word about supporting and engaging families of English learners, that parental engagement can be perceived very differently across cultures, where, for example, trusting the teacher as the professional and assuming she or he has the child's best interests at heart might preclude the type of involvement and advocacy that characterizes much of traditional parental engagement with school. So, for example, if your only accepted type of showing you're involved in your child's education is attending a traditional PTA meeting and, say, doing the fundraiser or working the book drive. And sort of, for some parents, they respect the teacher as the professional and assume that the teacher has the child's best interests at heart. And so checking up on the teacher, checking in, the sort of advocacy that a lot of parents do. So we just have to question our assumptions. If we're assuming that parents are only showing caring or engagement in certain ways, we might miss the other ways. And parents can be language partners. So student achievement can occur when families, schools, and communities work together. School programs should fit the needs of student parents and communities, especially in regards to technology. And effective programs assist parents in creating a home environment that fosters learning and provides support and encouragement for children's success. I don't know how many of you have a bilingual family liaison or some role like that at your school, but I've worked with those professionals who are just doing amazing work with parents in lots of different ways. And maybe we'll have time to talk about a few of those. So again, a note on engagement with parents should take culturally compatible forms, which may not include expecting parents to come physically to school to participate. And this extends to technology as well, where programs and technology tools should be discussed and introduced to parents as part of a broader relationship with students' families, where they might be both learners and knowledge producers or brokers, meaning parents might be both learners and knowledge producers or brokers. And this is back to that funds of knowledge idea. But this idea of engaging parents in ways that are comfortable for them and ways that are convenient for them, that are ways that are culturally compatible for them. So I remember working with a school, and they realized that a lot of the parents lived in one big apartment complex in several buildings within the complex. A huge percentage of the parents lived there. So instead of trying to get parents to come out at night and come to meetings and what might involve, them getting childcare and transportation and interrupting dinner, whatever it was, they would go to the parents. So they would go to where the families lived and hold the meetings there and do projects there. And, that's just an example of meeting the parents halfway, meeting the parents in the middle, in this case, physically meeting them. And a lot of districts, I'm sure a lot of your districts too, offer English classes for bilingual parents as well as primary language literacy or primary language courses. Some districts I've known of offer students and parents unlimited access to technology-based language learning at no cost. And in terms of the teacher mindset, blended learning when done well, I found this, I think this is so important. Blended learning when done well builds upon a foundation of excellent in-person teaching, where the teacher mindset includes a belief in the importance of innovation and data-driven teaching and learning, student choice and personalized learning, student discovery, including student-generated content, learning by doing, and a growth asset-based orientation. Super important. So English learners can be contributors in blended learning. In other words, they should have some choices. They should have some say. They should help set the parameters. They can work from their own interest areas. And they can be content creators in their own right. It's just fantastic if you can actually combine this with cross-age, where the older students are working with the younger students. It's very, very powerful. But blended learning sometimes requires that teachers can release some control. So teachers have the ability to closely guide and support students to do this work while embracing student autonomy, which means at times you have to be able to give up some control. So again, with teacher mindset and blended learning for ELLs, like differentiated instruction, requires teachers to examine their stance or approach. And it's really interesting because fundamentally these really have to do with one's philosophy of teaching and learning and involve being clear about one's beliefs about the big things, like the purpose of school and the purpose of assessment and evaluation. So it's not the technical aspects, right? You have to start with your own belief system if you want to try to change your teaching in this way to better meet students' needs. So, for example, are student differences the basis of some of your planning, or does that factor into your planning? Are students allowed to have variable pacing, or do they all have to start and end at the same place and time? Are students allowed choices and a voice? How much agency are they allowed? Do you employ are students allowed to show what they know in multiple ways? Are they allowed to learn in multiple ways and show what they know in multiple ways? In my program, the elementary teacher prep program, we just started a new class. Well, we actually redesigned an old class, and now it's called Multiple Ways of Knowing and Showing, because I think that's so important for teachers to know how to teach to multiple interests, multiple strengths, multiple intelligences, and allow students to show what they know in the way they know best, so that they can be successful. So in summary, the number of EL students is increasing rapidly, and of course technology is growing rapidly, and technology, specifically through a blended learning approach, can allow teachers sectional needs of English learners. And blended learning done well is aligned with what we know as effective instruction for English learners, making the two complementary. So blended learning done well can promote access, equity, and achievement for English learners, as it's well aligned with what we know as effective practice for English learners, where excellent teaching remains a critical variable. So that's what I have for you today. I think we might take a few questions. I think we have time for a few questions. So I'll invite Melanie to come back in, or at least ask us some questions. I don't know if you can hear me, Melanie.
Yep, I'm right here. I've been listening.
Oh, okay.
All along. Um, Thank you for your presentation. I think there were some really great ideas that you shared, and I know that definitely appreciated, and some ideas that people can put to use. I do have a couple questions for you. If you do have a couple minutes to answer them. One of the questions is, what are some of the skills that you believe teachers and paraprofessionals need in order to really help accelerate that learning for English learners?
Yeah, that's an important question. So teachers need to know some basic things about second language acquisition. They need to know the basic principles of second language acquisition. For example, that all languages share certain things like a sound system and a grammar system, but that those vary across languages. And so in some ways, those might facilitate learning a second or third language. And in other ways where they're very different, they might create certain difficulties for students. And then you can point out those differences, or leverage where they're the same. So they just need to know some basic things. Like, for example, there are some things that are very late acquired, so there's no point in drilling them or studying them early on. Of course, you'll introduce them naturally, but they're just things are acquired at different times. And like we talked about, the teachers need to be prepared both pedagogically and attitudinally. So they need to be willing and then know how to teach language and content simultaneously. And it would be great if teachers could start, if you don't already, start having, I know you already have content objectives, but start having language objectives for each of your lessons. And even if they're not great in the beginning, it's a great start. You can work on it. But yeah, and even if you can't formulate the exact objective, what is great to think about is, what am I asking the student to do, and what is it I need to provide for them to do it? So if I'm asking them to summarize, do they know how to summarize? If I'm asking them to read this passage, do they know some of the key vocabulary of this passage? So if you just think about what is the language demand, that's a really good way to get started too.
Awesome. Thank you. I have another question regarding the primary language. So why do you believe that good primary language instruction is important for the attainment of high levels of English literacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question. And I mean, there are literally decades of research on this. So this is not in question. This is a well-known research fact. That when students learn in the language they know best, that of course gives them an advantage. It promotes positive identity development to learn in your primary language, and school engagement. And this idea that we talked about before, this strong skills transfer. So if you have very strong skills, like you might see a student come in at middle grades who's, gone to a very accelerated school system somewhere and moved to the US and is now in English and might not actually speak much English at all. But by the end of the year is reading on or above grade level with the English speaking peers. And that's because that student has such strong primary language literacy that those skills transfer over. But what happens for so many students is they're transitioned out too quickly in these bilingual programs, which are called transitional bilingual ed programs. And they're not given the chance to really develop strong skills in the first language. And then they never really develop strong skills in the second language. And they're sort of stuck without strong skills in either language, which is a tragedy. And we shouldn't allow that to happen. But unfortunately, that does happen. But thank you for that question. That's an important question.
Thank you. And why do you believe that blended learning is effective in the instruction of English learners?
Well, it's all in how one does it. So it can allow students to be much more creative, have much more autonomy and agency. It assumes on the teacher's part that the student is up to doing this. The student is up to some self-mediated technology-enhanced learning. So it assumes, when we were talking about the mindset before, it assumes an asset-based, not a deficit view of the learner. And having a deficit view of the learner is one of the big contributing factors to why English learners don't succeed. They did a big study at secondary and found out that the key variable was teacher expectations of student achievement. So an asset-based approach is key, and that's key to the success of English learners, but we know that that's also part of the mindset for doing blended learning. It also lends itself to differentiated instruction, which is key for English learners. I mean, we would hope that for all learners, but it's key for English learners. And it allows more time and practice and feedback. And so those are things English learners need desperately. So those really are blended learning, and what we know about effective instruction for English learners, they really are complementary. And it's really exciting for me to think about the degree to which they're complementary. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good. And I think we have time for just one more question. And you touched on it near the end, but is there anything else that you want to say about how engaged families can make a difference for students who are learning English?
Oh gosh, I've seen schools just really work with parents in amazing ways. So I've seen two different schools do this now on both coasts. One was in Georgia and one's here in California, and they were many years apart. So it was interesting to see them doing a similar thing, but they were doing mother-daughter groups at the middle school level or at the elementary school level. So moms and daughters would meet and talk about a topic. They would have a guest speaker. In one case, they made a craft together every session. I think they met once a month. But, they would have a speaker. Like the last time I went, it was also a woman who had immigrated from Mexico. She was a university professor. She was talking about the importance of going to college and staying in school and getting good grades. But yeah, I guess the other thing I would say is just remember that parents are also bringing all of these assets and all of these funds of knowledge. And I just surveyed a whole bunch of parents at one school district and, got their ideas about what they needed and what they wanted and what was helpful to them. This was a district that was offering a lot of support to parents. So yeah, I guess just to remember that families show caring and engagement with schooling in different ways, and that families are very diverse. English learners are very diverse.
Is there anything else that you just kind of want to throw out there before we close up this webinar?
I wanted to thank everyone for their interest. I was just thrilled to see so many people care about this topic and join us today. And just thank you for everything you do. You're doing what I think is the most important work. So thank you for everything, and thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got some great participants. Thank you so much, Dr. Musetti, for your sharing your knowledge and your stories that you were able to do. Really appreciate that. You'll see Dr. Musetti's email address on the slide right now. Feel free to email her at her email address. You'll also see the Rosetta Stone site if you're interested in learning more about Rosetta Stone, and also the EdWeb evaluation. So please feel free to complete that. I know that they also posted it in the chat messages if you want to take a couple minutes to complete that EdWeb evaluation. And just a reminder, your certificate is coming. If you are attending live, you'll receive your certificate via email after about 24 hours. If you joined the session by phone or you're watching it as a recording, the quiz is available for you at edweb.net/language. Please feel free. It's a 4-question quiz, and you'll be able to receive your CE certificate after successfully completing that quiz. We appreciate that as well. And don't forget, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we have this wonderful free community, edweb.net/language. All the resources are there, online discussions, recordings, those quizzes. So lots of really wonderful information, giving you the ability to carry on the conversation beyond this webinar as well. So we hope to see you in that resource. And we appreciate, again, Dr. Musetti, and we appreciate everybody who took time out of their very busy lives to attend this webinar. And I wish you a very happy holidays and enjoy the rest of the year. Thank you again.
Thank you.